Imagine the scent of ancient incense and cold stone, a world built upon vows of silence and pious obedience. You stand at the threshold of the cloister, where the rigid geometry of faith was meant to contain the spirit. And for centuries, the nuns' habit symbolized absolute devotion, a life sequestered from the sinful currents of the world. But beneath the linen and wool, the human heart remains a powerful, often rebellious engine. What happens when the vow of silence is broken? Not by prayer, but by a roar. This is the hidden history of women who used the very walls of the convent not for retreat, but as a launching pad for radical defiance, revealing an enduring pattern where control inevitably breeds resistance. The medieval church was an empire of structure defining the role of women with chilling clarity. To be a nun was to accept a profound limitation, a surrender of autonomy deemed necessary for salvation. Yet history harbors those who treated these limitations as mere suggestions. And we speak now of the iron will required to challenge 1,000 years of dogma, risking not just reputation, but the very promise of the afterlife. Their stories are not tales of saints, but of revolutionaries who found their power within the most controlling of institutions, demonstrating that true authority is self-defined, even against the expectations of the age. Close your eyes and listen. Do you hear the gentle cadence of plainsong, or is that the searing electric wail of a guitar? Because this dissonance introduces us to Sister Rosetta Tharpe, a figure who fundamentally redefined the sound of faith. You expected meekness hymns sung softly by candlelight, but instead you are confronted by a sound so vital, so uncompromisingly loud it seems to burn the very air of the 1930s and 40s. She was the ultimate paradox. A woman of God, wielding a weapon of rhythm and noise, playing the electric guitar before the world even recognized the sound of rock and roll, establishing a timeless truth that tradition is meant to be amplified, not obeyed in silence. Rosetta Tharpe did not confine her ministry to the polite confines of the Sunday sermon. She moved her performance into nightclubs and secular theaters, venues reeking of whiskey and smoke, drawing crowds who had no conventional use for gospel. Imagine the scene. A black woman draped in the formal modesty of the church, plugging into an amplifier, shattering the expected quietude. Her audacity was structural, challenging not only racial barriers but the very notion of feminine restraint in performance. And while many attempted to sideline her, to reduce her fire, the intensity of her popularity was simply insurmountable, proving that authentic talent will always demand a stage, regardless of who sets the boundaries. Her collaborations were a deliberate transgression of the sacred-secular divide. Tharpe teamed with jazz trumpeter Lucky Millinder and various swing bands, grafting fiery gospel lyrics onto music considered purely profane. In 1944, she released Strange Things Happening Every Day, a record that shockingly pierced the Billboard charts, a milestone for gospel music that few understood at the time. She did not ask permission, she demanded space, and this fusion, this unapologetic volume, laid the foundation for the musical revolution that followed, though the credit would later be stolen by others, confirming the historical pattern that pioneers are often overlooked by the generations who benefit from their innovation. The electric guitar in her hands became more than an instrument. It was a symbol of liberation, a loud, undeniable proof of agency. Later icons of rock, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Johnny Cash, all walked the path she scorched. Yet the history books often politely overlook the nun who was doing it first, and, arguably, doing it louder, raising the immediate question, what came next, changed everything for the future of endurance. When piety became the engine for physical extremity, her defiance was foundational, proving that piety and power were not mutually exclusive, a lesson that constantly resurfaces throughout history. Shift your focus from the vibrant, clamoring stage of the 1940s to the quiet, determined grit of the 1980s. You witness a figure seemingly defined by the limitations of age and expectation, yet moving with the fierce dedication of a warrior. Sister Madonna Buder, the Iron Nun. At 48, an age when many settle into comfort, She chose the triathlon, a deliberate, grueling path of physical suffering designed to break the unprepared. She decided that devotion could be measured in miles, sweat, and absolute physical endurance, showing that the quest for self-mastery is a timeless human impulse. The demands of an Ironman race, a 2.4-mile swim, 112-mile bike ride, and 26.2-mile marathon run back-to-back, are brutal, even for athletes in their prime. Sister Madonna entered this arena in 1982, competing in Hawaii, consistently outperforming athletes decades her junior. She made a mockery of the age limit, pushing the boundaries of what the human body, particularly a body dedicated to contemplation, could achieve. And her existence on the circuit was a constant moving sermon on the power of the non-negotiable will, proving that dedication is the ultimate equalizer against perceived constraints. Imagine the sight of her crossing the finish line, the sun-baked dust on her habit, the salt crusting her face, setting new records as the oldest woman to complete the race. Her persistence became a logistical problem for organizers who worried for her health in her 90s, forcing them to extend cutoff times just to accommodate her relentless determination. She redefined ritual, replacing the prescribed prayers of the cloister with the agonizing, purifying ritual of physical suffering, a moving testament to the fact that discipline knows no age, defying the assumption that the human spirit must slow down. Now we move from the physical arena of the Ironman to the nascent cold logic of the computer lab in the 1950s, a world then exclusively masculine. Enter Sister Mary Kenneth Keller, a woman who decided that the pursuit of the divine should be paired with the pursuit of binary code. She saw the new technology not as a threat, but as a tool of intellectual liberation, demonstrating that curiosity is a force that transcends generational technological shifts. At Dartmouth College, where women were often barred from the technical labs, Keller simply walked in. She positioned herself at the very heart of computational research, challenging the unwritten laws of academic exclusion. Her goal was not just to participate, but to master the complexities of the emerging field, culminating in her becoming the first woman in the United States to earn a PhD in computer science, claiming her intellectual space with a quiet yet revolutionary competence, confirming that systemic barriers can be dissolved by sheer determined presence. Keller's work on the basic programming language, beginner's all-purpose symbolic instruction code, was a democratization of knowledge. Before basic computing was reserved for the initiated, a priesthood of engineers speaking obscure languages, Keller sought to simplify the interface, making the power of the computer accessible to the masses. And her legacy is not merely academic, but populist, as she helped pull the lever that brought technology out of the institutional dungeons and into the common classroom, establishing the precedent for technological accessibility we still rely on today. Consider the dim light filtering through the stained glass windows of a 12th century priory, a sanctuary meant to protect women from the sinful world, because you are now privy to the darkness that sometimes festered within. At Wotton Priory, a young nun, trapped by a life she did not choose, sought forbidden indulgence with a lay brother. This was more than a private lapse. It was a fundamental violation of dignity, a challenge to the entire moral structure of the convent, highlighting the persistent tension between institutional repression and human desire. When the transgression was discovered, the reaction was swift, visceral, and utterly devoid of Christian compassion. The sisterhood, positioning themselves as the ultimate moral authority, enacted a punishment of severe suffering. They detained the lay brother, forcing the young nun to witness his agonizing fate. And the public nature of the ordeal transformed their violation into a terrifying collective ritual of control, designed to purge sin from the community through the application of horrific cruelty, showing that fear is often the most effective tool of rigid authority. Following the intense confrontation, the young nun was condemned to an even more profound psychological ordeal. She was forced to carry the physical evidence of the man's collapse, a morbid, symbolic display of the cost of her transgression. She was then locked away in absolute isolation, treated as the convent's shameful secret, a potent warning against any future thought of defiance, and the supposed sisters showed no mercy, demanding her complete submission to their rigid, unforgiving power, confirming the tragic truth that those who break the rules often become symbolic sacrifices. 4 centuries later, another nun in England chose a more cunning path to freedom. In 14th century Yorkshire, Joan of Leeds grew weary of the endless cycle of prayer and fasting. She sought the path of carnality, choosing to abandon holy orders for a life unbound by sacred stricture, recognizing that to truly escape, she had to erase herself entirely from the religious record, proving that sometimes the only way to achieve freedom is through complete, calculated deception. Joan's plan was audacious. She faked her own death. The sheer planning involved, crafting an elaborate dummy of herself to leave behind, suggests a deep, cold determination. She relied on the naive faith of her fellow nuns who accepted the fabricated body without question, eager to believe she had simply passed on to the Lord. And this successful deception bought her the time she needed to vanish, embracing the life of carnal lust the Church so vehemently condemned. A perfect example of a deliberate historical vanishing act. Imagine the bishop's rage when the truth finally surfaced. The funeral was a sham. The deceased nun was alive, living a life of freedom outside the walls. You can almost see the frantic scribbling of the official warrant hunting her down like a medieval fugitive. But Joan of Leeds proved that sometimes the only way to defeat the suffocating structure of power is to simply disappear, leaving behind an empty symbol where your body should have been, illustrating that evasion can be the ultimate form of resistance against monolithic control. The defiance continued into the modern era, trading habits for picket lines. Sister Margaret Traxler, born in 1924, embodied a powerful mix of religious fervor and fierce social justice advocacy. She did not interpret her vows as a mandate to retreat. She saw them as a call to action in the deepest shadows of civil conflict, and her presence was disruptive, demanding that faith translate into direct physical confrontation with injustice, reaffirming that spiritual commitment must be expressed through real-world action. In 1965, while many of her peers prayed from a distance, Sister Margaret was on the ground during the Selma to Montgomery marches alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Imagine the shock of the Alabama segregationists seeing a nun habit flying marching directly into the heart of the racial conflict. She demonstrated that true service required getting one's boots dirty, challenging the prevailing notion that religious women should remain politically invisible, establishing a timeless precedent for faith-based social activism. Her fight was dual-pronged. While confronting external racism, she also challenged the patriarchal structure of the Catholic Church itself, criticizing its systemic lack of voice for women. She co-founded the National Coalition of American Nuns, dedicated to forcefully injecting feminist ideals into a tradition built on male supremacy. She saw hypocrisy under her own roof and attacked it with the same determined glare she reserved for the state troopers of Alabama, proving that true reform must address both external injustice and internal systemic flaws. Now, rewind to the 12th century, where a Benedictine nun transformed retreat into global influence. Hildegard of Bingen, cloistered for life, did not let those walls limit her output. She used them as a forge, and what began as obedience evolved into a spectacular self-driven expansion of knowledge and art that few men of her era could match, showing how isolation can become the perfect incubator for revolutionary thought. Hildegard claimed to receive vivid, overwhelming visions, a direct symbolic conduit to the divine. She documented these complex, mind-bending experiences in her book Scivias Know the Ways, which was regarded not as madness, but as an undeniable source of spiritual truth. She also composed music, long, complex chants, symphonia that demanded technical virtuosity, proving that the deepest form of worship could also be the most demanding art, cementing her legacy as the medieval genius who redefined female authority. Her intellect stretched into medicine, documented in Physica and Causae et Curae. She explored herbal remedies, stones, and natural therapies, compiling a medieval pharmacy of knowledge. The scope of her work, from theology and music to cosmology and natural science, made her a polymath who operated entirely outside the traditional academic system, proving that genius cannot be confined by a habit or a stone wall, a lesson that intellectual freedom is always possible if the will exists. Move to 17th century New Spain, Mexico, where the shadows of patriarchy were absolute. You encounter Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, a self-taught intellectual who devoured knowledge deemed unfit for women. Barred from formal university, she chose the convent as a sanctuary, not of piety, but of intellect, transforming her cell into a library and laboratory, finding the ultimate loophole to secure her right to study. Sor Juana's defiance was penned in devastatingly precise Baroque verse. Her satirical essays, notably Hombres Necios, foolish men, called out male hypocrisy with razor-sharp wit, challenging the very men who sought to control her access to knowledge. When a bishop dared to lecture her under a pseudonym, she responded with the Respuesta a Sor Filotea, a magnificent defense of a woman's right to reason and learn, a critical foundational feminist text that still rings true today. This public display of intellectual superiority was unforgivable to the church authorities. Eventually, she was stripped of her books, her scientific instruments, and her right to write. Her intellectual rebellion met a systemic, tragic end, forced back into traditional caretaking duties during a plague, where she worked until her death in 1695, and the institutional power ensured that her brain, her greatest threat, was tragically silenced, confirming that the powerful will always seek to eliminate the source of uncomfortable truth. These women, from the electric guitarist to the iron athlete, the computational pioneer to the feminist poet, all wore the uniform of submission, yet cultivated a radical individual power that transcended the strictures of their era. They prove that true rebellion is not always about tearing down the walls, but about occupying the space, transforming its meaning, and using its perceived limitations as a foundation for spectacular, unexpected greatness. A human pattern of transcending imposed boundaries. This exploration has examined themes of power, corruption, and human conflict within historical contexts, focusing entirely on the complex social and personal histories of these remarkable figures. For educational and historical purposes, the shadow cast by history's great institutions is often long and misleading. If this story made you reflect on fragility of power and the unexpected strength of the defiant spirit, stay with us for the next chapter, as we continue to illuminate the hidden corners of the past.